Hi everyone and welcome to CS50 Week 9 section. My name is Yulia and I'm a preceptor here on Harvard's campus helping with all things CS50 on college and online. And today is going to be our last section. We're going to talk about web development, web programming, really just put all of the things together, Python, SQL, HTML, and now Flask that we've learned this week to create our own websites. And to take a little peek of what's coming ahead, here's our agenda, which consists of quite a few things, but hopefully breaking it down will help you understand better how we can structure our websites. And contrary to what we did last week, where we used just HTML and CSS, maybe a little bit of JavaScript, we're gonna make these websites even more dynamic, even more interactive, with even more features that we saw last week. And before we get started, let's talk about our example of today's section. So today we're gonna work on the birthdays website, and the end goal might look something like this, where we want to input some birthdays, for example, birthdays of your friends, and then on the bottom, we're going to display a table of all the inputted birthdays in a nicely formatted way. And in just a second, we're going to take a little tour of what's already in there, but most of these functionalities we'll implement ourselves together today. And let's talk a little bit about, what goes behind these websites, specifically birthdays or even finance, which is one of the problems in this week's problem set that you will jump into. And it really is anchored on this model of MVC, Model View Controller, whereby view is sort of what you see as a user, right? The visual aspect of the website. So the HTML files themselves, the CSS stylistics. So the view of the website itself. The second part, the controller, is this intermediary guide that helps actually have this interactive part between, okay, this is what the user sees, the view, and the model itself. So the controller would be, for example, submitting, adding the birthday, right? Like having this interaction in our application. And then lastly, the model is usually where we would store our data, right? So something that exists on the back end that user doesn't necessarily have access to, and that would be our database in this case. So having this sort of three-way relationship of the view being something that the user sees online, right, when they open the web page. Controller is the intermediary part that connects the two things together. And this is what we usually see in app.py, right? So the one where we render our templates, where we query the database, where we grab the information from the page. So this is where everything sort of comes together. And then the model is usually, that backend, that database or some logic that is not necessarily available to user to just look at, but obviously it is a fundamental a foundational part of the website. And now looking a little bit ahead, this is how our birthdays folder is structured. So this would be a quite common setup if you're using the MVC model, whereby static is where you would usually put styles sheets or even images, something that doesn't necessarily change, hence the word static. Templates is where you will store your HTML pages. So in this case, we only have one, index.html, but if you're creating more of them, templates is the folder where they would go into. App.py is that controller piece, right? That pieces everything together and makes all of these things interactive. And then birthdays.db or whatever other database you have is the last component here. But before we keep moving, let's talk a little bit about what parts of this folder exactly attributes to what part of the MVC model. For example, which parts of this birthday folder sort of attribute to the view component of the model, or I guess the framework. So the view component, which files or even folders in this setup help us create the view part. Yeah, so index HTML and styles CSS. So right, those visual pieces that the user sees on the website, and obviously HTML is where we render everything, what the user is able to see. Style CSS really helps us with this visual component, right? Like making things pretty, making things look nicer. What about controller? And I know I gave it off a little bit already, so this should be an easy guess. But what about controller? Which part of this folder setup relates to it? app.py, exactly. So app stands for application, and this is where we write like our logic, right? Like our back end, where we are creating all the necessary steps of grabbing the data, maybe from the user, processing it in some way, maybe looking into our database, and then outputting something to view. And then lastly, if we're talking about the model, so I mentioned briefly that that's like data related, or maybe something that exists sort of like on the back end, and the user might not necessarily have direct access to. Birthdays.db, yeah, exactly. So birthdays.db is where we store our information, and DB stands for database. And let's take a little peek into what we have here. So if on the first slide we saw how the birthdays website should look like in the end, this is what we have so far. So pretty bare bones, right? It just has the sections, right? It's sort of like components that we need to fill ourselves. But if we, let me create a new terminal. But if we take a look into each of the files, for example, app.py, right? It's something similar to what you might have seen during the lecture when David was talking about one of the applications. And we're gonna, wave our hand of all of the things that come beforehand. And I'm just gonna say that this is really helpful for our website to run. But paying attention to the more juicy part, right? This is where we're going to write all of our functionalities. So some things already exist here. For example, defining a route, and we're gonna very briefly talk about what it is, the methods that this route will take, and then some commented to-dos that it will be up to us to implement. Okay, and then let's take a peek at index.html. Oh, what is it called? Aha. Let me delete this guy then. Okay, so I had to cd into templates first before I did code index.html. So here already too, we have some pre-populated web pages, right? Since we already saw this bare bones part, so there must be something already in the HTML. And again, we're not gonna go line by line to talk about what each part represents, but you see some familiar things. For example, the reference of some specific styles, the local styles sheet, and then already some divisions or containers that were created for us, as well as the table. So let's go back and let's start talking about even more details that go into this, right? Like this is still like waving our hand, and like there's the controller and there's the view and the model, and this is how the folder looks like. But how exactly do we put all of these things together? Well, let's start talking about routes. And this is something that you probably see in the day-to-day life as well, right? If maybe google.com is like the general website, right? Like after that you see slash, and then it routes you to specific things. Or similarly, pretty much on any website you would go to now, there is the main domain and then the specific route that allows you to access those web pages. So for example, if we were to have a birthdays.net domain for our website, the slash route would just be the main page, right? And that's very common as well, to just have slash represent the main page, so the landing page where the user would go to in the first place. But maybe there's a second page with a route ad, and those have completely different functionalities, right? Like in the ad, perhaps we would want to add a birthday, or maybe even add like a friend to our friend group list. And the way that we can define what exactly happens when the user sort of encounters that route is by having such syntax. So the first line would be defining that specific route. So for example, slash or slash add, wherever you want your user to redirect. And then after that is where you're defining the function itself, right? So the second part of it is really something that we've been familiar with, right? We've been creating our own functions. You can think about it as almost writing a helper function, right? Like a very specific one that would pertain just for that web page. And so in this case, you can just define it as index, as that's commonly given name to the main pages. And then after that, you just might want to return the index page. And the function for that would be render template. And they all really come from this like Flask micro library. So if you're like curious, like, oh, do I have to write render template yourself? No, you don't. Someone already took care of it. And that's why we are using Flask micro libraries, our stepping stone, right? We're using all of the things that were pre-made before for us. So for example, if we just wanted to have a plain main page, right? For example, something is already written in index HTML and we just want to render it, this would be a quite simple setup to achieve that. Okay. And then lastly, of course, you're familiar with the lecture, we use Flask run to actually, see that website come to life. So similar to HTTP server, where it was just like a local host and then we're able to see it on a different web page, Flask run just creates this like temporary link that you can access and see your app. But there's another part, and again, it was sort of like there, but hidden, request methods. So if we go back to this slide again, what request method does this route take? What is the method here? Get, exactly, but we don't specify that. And the reason for that is because get is the default. So if you're just wanting to sort of like render the web page or display something, you're not necessarily submitting anything, you don't need to specify get explicitly because that would be a default. But if your page is both for rendering and displaying something and submitting some data, it is important to specify that it can be both the get and the post. And just to get a little bit of practice, let's consider these different scenarios and think about which request method we would pick in each scenario. So for example, if the user goes to a website and lands on the login page, would that be a get or a post? So I'm just typing, for example, birthdays.net/login, enter. Yeah, exactly. That would be a get, right? Because we are just landing on the web page. We haven't even submitted anything, right? We just maybe typed the URL or navigated from somewhere in Google, and we're just rendering the web page. Like I want to see just the login HTML rendered in front of me. But if a user enters their username and password and clicks login, is that get or post? Post, exactly. So this is sort of like the second step of that scenario. I navigated to birthdays.net login. I saw the rendered web page in front of me, but now I have typed my username and my password and I clicked the button, right? So I'm sending some information back to my app.py so that maybe I can go into the database and check, is the password correct and does the user exist? So anytime when you have this submit action or some grabbing information from the user and giving it to app.py, you want to use post. And while you could still use get, post just adds this layer of security to your information because we wouldn't want your username or password to be public. But what about user submitting its birthday? And I'm going to talk a little bit less here to give you some time to guess. But if a user submits a birthday, is that post or get? Post, exactly. So again, a very good keyword to look out for, even if you're thinking, right, through the design of your web app. if you're saying, okay, on X page, I want my user to submit Y. Submit is your keyword, right? Like that's post. And lastly, if a user navigates to the main page of the birthdays website, would that be get or post? Get, exactly. Perfect. So now that we talked a little bit about that, let me take a pause and ask, what questions do we have? Yeah, so if we're using get, so someone asked, would get in the form mean that the inputs are in the URL? Yes, so if we're using get as our method for the form, that would mean that whatever inputs you have will show up on the URL. And as David mentioned in the lecture, that's not ideal, especially for sensitive information like login, password, and username. I think I saw some questions above as well. Okay. Do we have, what other questions do we have about? Yeah, so post requests are more secure than get requests, exactly. And for the reason that we don't see the information that the user inputs in the URL. All right, let's move on and talk about forms. So far I've been talking about submit, right? Like submitting the information, but how exactly can we grab that information from the user? So this is jumping to the HTML side of things, right? Because we're thinking about the view part of the framework. So whatever the user sees, and that attributes to the HTML files. So now we're going to talk about that. And as the name suggests, the tag for the form would be form. And then inside of it, you can specify the sort of like features of it, the attributes. So the action is where we would specify the route to request, right? So what do we want to navigate to? And then the method is where we specify get or post. And as we talked, it could also be get, but post would be preferred. And then we just set up this sort of like container you can always imagine, but there's nothing inside of the form yet. It's currently blank. So we also need to specify the inputs, right? The specific empty boxes where the user can actually type in the information. And in fact, it can be multiple ones. It doesn't have to be just one. So for example, to replicate the birthdays website, we might want to do something like this, where the first three elements are the input elements specifying friend's name, month, and day. And notice that the type is also specified in each of the tags. So the first one is text because we want to get the name of our friend. And then the second and the third are numbers because we want to make sure that the user only inputs the numbers for month and day. You could try to, accommodate for month being typed in as a word, but we'll simplify things a little bit. And then lastly, we have our button submit. So in between the two tags, you see the submit word, and that's would like specify what you see displayed over there. But the type submit is different in a way that it just submits the form when it's clicked. So in short, this is the part that can be changed, but the type must be submit because we want to make sure it gets back to app.py. So now that we know a little bit more and we talked about forms and the routes, let's start changing some things. So let's go to our CS50.dev and let's add the form itself to the HTML file. So we already very conveniently have a to-do here. And on the slides just now, we saw pretty much the outline of what it would look like. So first, let's create a form tag. And inside of the tag, we want to specify the action, which would just be the slash, and then the method being post, because we want to ensure that it's secure. And then after that, we're just going to have a bunch of input tags where the user would actually input the information. So the first one would be for the name, and let's call it friend, just so that it's not name equals name, which is a little confusing. The type of it is text, because we want to make sure that the user is typing in the word. Next would be month. And this is just by American standards, where a month comes before the day. But if you're doing it on your own, definitely feel free to flip it, whatever makes the most sense to you. Was the type being number, because we want to make sure, again, that the user is inputting the correct information. And then the last one is also number, but for the day. And finally, we have the submit button, that will help us actually send birthday, the information back to app.py. So let me save this and let me reload. And now I see the input fields, and I also see my add birthday button. Right now it's also as an input, so let me change it to button. Oh. Let's see. Every time I test something and it works, and then when I actually need to show it to you guys, it doesn't. But here it is. So 3 input fields, and then the button that will help us submit the birthday to our database. But I argue we can make things a little bit more intuitive for the user as well. Like, they don't really know what they were supposed to put where, so we can explore another tag that's called placeholder. So this would be that gray text that sometimes shows up in the text fields when you try to input something on the website. So for that, we can specify that too. So for example, name, placeholder, month, and then placeholder day. And that should give the user a little bit more intuition as to what is expected of them. So for example, my name is Julia, and then add birthday, right? But nothing is happening so far because we haven't really updated the database. We haven't connected things to each other. So right now I'm just clicking and it goes somewhere, but not really getting recorded. But what other things we can consider here? For example, if I type Julia, that works, right? Now notice when I try to type letters, and you can't see on my keyboard, but I'm actually trying to hit some letters, it's not inputting. When I try numbers, it works. But what if I accidentally want to type months as like December being 12, and then I accidentally click 123, right? That's not right. There is no month 123, right? It stops at 12, but it's still letting me submit it. So for that too, there's some guardrails that we can implement, and specifically inside of the tags, we can specify the min and the max values. So for month, the min would be 1, and then the maximum would be 12. Similarly, for day, the minimum is 1, and then the maximum is 31. So let us save it here. Let's go back to the web page. Julia is fine, but here when I try to type to whatever, it lets me type it, but then it gives me a warning that it must be less than or equal to 12. Similarly, if I try to do -6 and I try to submit it, it doesn't work, right? And you can get a little bit nitpicky and you say, well, if the month is February, the max is 28, and then not each month has 31 days. But those are all like the small details that you can think about later. But this is sort of like the bare bones guardrails that would prevent the user from typing, for example, day 123 or some months that doesn't exist. Okay, so now we have some part of the website implemented. And let's go back to our slides and keep exploring it even further. So now that we updated the view, right, we have the visual part on the website signaling to the user where they need to input in the information, what exactly they need to input. Now we need to implement this interactive component, right? Updating our model and our controller so that the two actually interact between each other. So in terms of updating the model, right? Like how do we get the information from the website? Like we input it on the HTML, but where does it go? And this is sort of like, again, where we can wave our hands and say, this is how we all make it work. So notice that when I was creating my input tags, I specified a name for each of them. So for example, for the name field, it's friend, for the month field, it's month, and for the day field, it's day. And these exactly are the parameters that will help us grab these values. And the way that we do it is by using request_form.get, and then inside of the parentheses specifying that specific name of the input that you want to grab. For example, in this case, it would be friend. And again, you can see sort of like the top part being the app.py and the bottom part being the HTML tag that we had already pre-created. So that is the grabbing of the value. But how do we actually update the model? Well, this is where SQL comes back in, right? We didn't learn it for nothing. We didn't learn it just to do 50vil. This is where we can use SQL and create even more complex websites. So before we jump into that, let's go back and let's see. Let's try to take a look at the database. Okay. Oh, it's birthdays.db. Open anyway. So this is a visual way to look at the database. So what we already have in here is a table called birthdays. So if we click on it, we can see that there's already some information, particularly from the Harry Potter movies. So Harry, Ron, and Hermione, their birthdays. We can then also look at the structure of this table that was already created for us. So you can notice that there are 4 columns. The first one is ID, and it's something that, again, computer just like takes care of on its own. We don't have to specify it as it's a primary key. And then the next 3 columns are name, month, and day, which is exactly what we were just building together in our HTML page. So these are exactly the values that we want to update. And so going back to our slides, the way that we do that is by inserting some data into the table. And while we haven't really practiced that during week 7, the concept of it is very similar to what we've seen before, right? Having the keyword specifying the table and its columns and the exact values that we want to input. And again, sort of like the glue that connects us all is the controller, right? So the app.py application, where we would also do db execute and use our SQL commands instead of just typing them into the terminal, we just combine everything together in our Python file. And actually, it's very simple in a way that beyond just adding db execute, your queries stay the same. So you would probably type something like select star from birthdays, where month equals, for example, 12 in your terminal. Here, we're just adding this additional component of dynamism, right? So I don't want to be always querying for month equals 12 or month equals 11. I want to have this component be interactive and have users input to it. And to do that, we can use this question mark operator that would just be a placeholder for whatever we want, for whatever value we want to give you. And the idea is very similar to the one we had in C, where, for example, we had %i for integers or %s for strings, having that placeholder and then specifying the variable which value we want to take after the comma. And as with C, we can have multiple values inside of the query. So in this case, month and day, just go comma by comma after the quotes. And while it didn't necessarily show you how to do the insertion, again, the concepts are very, very similar, and we will do it together in just a second. Okay, so let's go back to our CS50.dev and now implement the update of the model, right? So something that will help us make things even more interactive. Let's go back to CS50.dev and now let's implement the controller component that will help us make this more interactive. And that, like I just mentioned on the slides, we're going to use request.form.get to get those components from the inputs. So using request.form.get, in this case, I want to grab the friend input. Next, I want to grab the month input. And finally, day. So exact same syntax for all three of them, just getting the user's input. Oh. Let me kill this. Okay. Just grabbing user's input from the web page. And now let's actually insert it into the database. So as I just mentioned, it would just be using the db.execute function, where db is the database that we actually sort of like pre-opened before. So I'm not just putting db and hoping I'll figure it out. You'll still need to specify it, and definitely feel free to poke around afterwards, like trying to understand all the other lines. But this is where we sort of like activate the birthdays database that we then are able to reference to just as db. And then inside of the parentheses, we're just going to write our regular SQL query. So again, having our keywords, the table, and then specifying one by one the columns into which we want to input these new values. And again, the syntax might be a little weird because we didn't really work with insert a couple of weeks back, but still the same ideas. And then, as I mentioned before, after the comma, we are specifying the inputs that we want to give. So notice how all three things sort of like correlate with each other, right? So in the columns, the order is name, month, day. And then for the values, we also want to make sure that they are in the same order as the columns so that we are inputting information into the right things. So let's save this and let me clear the terminal and let me run Flask again. Let's see. Okay. All right. So now if I type Yulia and I type month and day and I add birthday, nothing really happens here. But if I go back to cs50.dev and let's see, maybe open a new terminal and cd into my folder, run SQLite birthdays, SQLite 3 birthdays. And here I do select from birthdays just to see everything that's inputted. And now see that in addition to Harry, Ron, and Hermione, there is now my name on the very bottom, because now we've added this new layer, right, of interacting between the view that the user sees information that they put in with our database so that we can actually store all of this data inside of it. Okay? And again, as with our, the min and the max that we just implemented in the input, there are always some guardrails, right? You need to think about when you're implementing, especially users facing websites, right? So if we thought about implementing the min and max for day and the month, here we also want to consider, has the user even inputted anything? Right? Like we don't want to try to insert an empty day or an empty month into our database. So one really good check when working with users' inputs on the websites is checking if the input even exists. And for that, it's slightly abbreviated, but if not name, essentially we'll check is the name empty or not. And if it is, we just want to redirect back to the main page, sort of like re-prompting the user in a way to input the correct, to input any information, in fact. So very similar idea for all of them. So making sure we redirect in case they don't input anything. Let me rerun this. For example, now if I try to input David's birthday, but I accidentally skip a month and I just add a day, again, nothing will necessarily happen here, but if I go back to, let's see. If I go back to my SQL query and I select from birthdays again, that was not supposed to happen. Let me see what I might have done wrong. It's not supposed to get to this line. Oh, okay, I missed return. So redirect will redirect it to the right route, but you also want to make sure you include the return statement, which I didn't. So let's try this one more time. So maybe if I want to input Carter's birthday, and then I miss months, but I do input the day, and then I add birthday. Let's try to see if that shows up in the database, and it doesn't. Okay, yay. So it is working as intended, but I did miss the return statement, so make sure you are adding that as well. And again, there are different sort of other guardrails that you can implement here. So as I mentioned earlier, you can think about cases where if it is February, you want to make sure that the day doesn't exceed 28, or for certain months, it can only be up to 30. So definitely some other components that you can think about when making the websites, but definitely this is the part where we want to make sure we're getting very defensive, right? We need to think about all the possible errors that the user can make and try to think of ways of steering them into other direction or preventing these errors from happening in the first place. Okay, that was a lot, right? Like our first sort of integration of a database and the HTML together. So let me take a pause and ask what questions do we have before we jump to our last few parts. Yeah, so very good question. Why are we using input and not button? So it's sort of an idea that we want to make sure that we are submitting it. And let me actually test if it works the same with button. So with button, it's actually not showing up properly either. And input is what allows us to actually have this interaction between app.py and HTML. And the sort of the button part of it on the HTML that we saw comes from the submit. So it's almost like, yes, it is an input, but we're not explicitly typing anything in there. We're submitting it. But this is what creates this connection between the HTML and app.py. Okay, any other questions we have while we're here? And again, this is so many different layers that we are adding on very quickly, so definitely feel free to take a look at it afterwards and sit down on your own to really think it through it line by line. But for now, let's go back to our last piece where we're actually going to render the templates, right? So far, we've just been outputting the regular HTML files, something that was very common when we just worked with HTTP server in week 8, but now that we have the component of the database and the app.py, we can even make the generation of these web pages more interactive, not just like the static universal ways of outputting things. So for example, if we want to tailor the messages, right? If we had like an index HTML and all we wanted to say is the message is X, this is how we might want to do it. And someone asked earlier, but this is where we actually encounter Jinja. And that's what really helps us make these websites interactive and creating sort of a different layer of interaction between the app.py and the HTML files. So by using this function called render template and specifying in the quote the specific template that you want to render, then you can provide these tailored outputs in different variables. So in this case, we want to specify that the message is hello, and you can certainly add more than one variables to the render template function. In fact, we can also play around with lists. So this is something we're going to see in just a second, and it's very similar to what we're going to do. But you not only can pass one variable, right? You can pass lists and dictionaries, and on the bottom is how we would operate it, right? Instead of maybe saying birthday 1 is February 2 and birthday 2 is February 28, because that's certainly not how we store information. Passing in the entire list and then using Jinja syntax and the HTML file, we can have this dynamism in our web pages. So having, again, this Jinja syntax is really helpful for us because we can create this dynamism again, but on a different level, where we now have interaction between the app.py feeding information into the HTML file, and we can then generate some tailored templates again, depending on where you are on your web page. And lastly, the dictionaries as well, which is a very powerful data structure we've been using. Sort of similar idea, just slightly different syntax, is if we used just for birthday in birthdays, outputting the birthday, which is the syntax very similar to Python. In dictionaries, we instead want to access the keys using the dot notation so that we could access the specific values that we're looking for. And what I've been referencing so far is Jinja. So something, again, we saw in the lectures. And the main two differences is that when we're working with sort of like for loops or if statements, the Jinja expression is using the curly braces and the percentages. But when we're working with Jinja variables, we want to make sure we're using two curly braces to sort of like encompass that variable and then output it on the web page. So for the final time, let's go back to cft.dev and finish implementing our app so that we have a final project. Actually, let me kill all of these terminals so that I don't confuse myself. Alrighty, so let's make a new one. Perfect. All right, so let's go back to app.py, and we've so far created the get part of things, right? So if request method is, the post side of things. So if request method is post, it means we're submitting a form, right? Or the user has submitted the form, and so we're grabbing all of this data and we're putting it into the database, and then we're just like sending them back to the main page. But again, let's consider the scenario that we talked about in the beginning. What if the user just navigates to the birthdays page, right? They haven't submitted anything, they haven't touched any buttons, they just want to see all of the birthdays that have been outputted there so far. And this is where, again, we come back to SQL and create this interaction level. And we might want to query for all of the birthdays that already exist there. And so again, using db execute, db being the birthdays database, we can simply just grab all of the birthdays, like all of the data, the names and the month and the day from our birthdays table. And then after that, as we just saw on the slides, this is again where we have this two-way control. And by rendering the template, we can now also specify what birthday, or like what information we want to input. And in this case, it would be birthdays. So again, if we didn't have it, index.html would just be the plain submit form. We wouldn't see anything else. And also, if we just specified, right, like hard-coded all of the names and all of the days and all of the months, what happens if I have a new friend, right, and I want to add a new birthday? Then I would have to go to HTML, manually edit it there. It will also be harder to store it. So having this three-way interaction of having a model with the database that stores all of the information, the controller that interacts now between the model and the view side, we can now create more, again, dynamic and tailored web pages. And now that I've passed into the template the birthdays information, we now can go back to our HTML file and now actually loop through these entries so that we can actually output something. So let me get on the new line here. And this is where we're going to use Jinja syntax, which might be slightly, unusual to what we've seen before, but actually it's very similar to Python. We just have the specific syntax that we need to account for. So as I mentioned before, if we're using like a for loop or an if statement, the syntax would be curly braces and %sign. And then after that, it's very similar, simple syntax to what we have in Python. One important thing, though, is anytime you start a block, so in this case it would be a for block, you want to make sure you end it. So since we started it here for birthday and birthdays, we want to make sure we end it whenever we don't want to loop through it anymore. And now inside of it, I'm just going to create a row tag. And then inside of that, the actual element tags. I don't want it like that. Okay. And then on the other line, I'm going to create another element tag. Okay. Inside of them now, we're going to use slightly different Jinja syntax, just being set of two curly braces now. And inside of them, we're going to specify what we want to grab. But this is sort of like the roadblock that we run into, right? Like, what data structure is B-Day, right? Birthdays would just be whatever all the SQL queries we ran and the information we got back. But actually, now that I'm thinking, what is birthdays data structure either? Like, what do we get back when we run a query through db execute in Python? What kind of data structure do we get back? Yeah, so it's actually a list of dictionaries. So let's see what the best way to do it. So if I print birthdays here, okay, and let me do Flask run. So we can open this in the browser. Okay, so I actually didn't even need print. So before I actually specified, right, like how I want to access it, we can see that this is essentially what we get back from our database. So it's sort of already parsed into one by one element, but essentially it is a list of dictionaries, and each dictionary represents the specific row in our database. So the first row was Harry, was the months and the day, and so forth and so on. And I think if I go back to cs50.dev and I look in here, we can actually see the square brackets, right, in our output. So the square brackets would indicate the list, and then inside of it we see that it is a dictionary. So by looping birthday in birthdays, I get one element in my list, right, which is a dictionary. So then I need to go one step further and actually grab the values that I am interested in. So in this case, name, and then on the second line, I want to grab birthday month and birthday day. And again, since it's just text, right? Like it's just variable text, it still works like an HTML file. So if I want to specify month/day, I could use the simple syntax in the same way that if we just had, say, 12th, like December 3rd, we could just do this. So treating it as simple text, but the one that can just change. So let us save this and let us go back to the birthdays page. Let me zoom out for a second. And now we see all of the birthdays outputted. David doesn't have a date to his birthday, but right, all the others have the specified names, the birthday month, and the birthday day itself. Okay, so maybe let's try playing around a little bit with it. So if I wanted to add, say, Carter, and maybe July 14, now that I added it, notice how it refreshed. And now if I scroll to the very bottom, fingers crossed, I see Carter's name added with the birthday that I just inputted. And then let's play around with a couple of things, right? So as before, maybe let's test for like very weird values, right? Try to submit this. It doesn't work. And notice how it will just look at the very first one that went wrong. Like it knows that if the month is not right, like I need to focus on that first before I even look into other things. So now if I fix it to, I don't know, March, for example, now it's focusing on day and saying me that that should be less. But if I forget, for example, to input the day for Alice, ideally we shouldn't see anything in the database. And let's scroll down, and we didn't. And that might not be like super user-friendly, right? Because if they accidentally mistyped it and then they don't see it in the outputted on the table, that's not very intuitive why, but adding some alerts and maybe some other visuals could be helpful for making it more user-friendly. But I think for now, we have a pretty good bare bones website that would allow us to keep track of our friends' birthdays. Okay, this was a lot today, so let me take a pause and for a couple of minutes take our last minute questions that we have about Flask. Okay. So someone asked about the syntax for the dictionary, and that's again just how Jinja works. So yeah, in Python, what we did was the dictionary name, square brackets, and inside of the square brackets, we would specify the key. But in Jinja, we just use a dot notation that is slightly different, but still is serving the same purpose. And for adding alerts, you could maybe even, and something you'll see in finance, so right, to tell the user that maybe something went wrong, you can have a separate HTML page where you would render a tailored apology or a message to the user. For example, if we are error checking and there is no month inputted, we could, instead of just redirecting back to the main page, we could render a template specifying a message to the user, right? Like something more, making more user-friendly and intuitive, saying, please input the month, or you forgot to input the month. This was CS50 week 9, and this would be our last section of the semester. So thank you so much for tuning in, and see you next year. Bye.